So good evening, everybody. I'm Ed Sierra, the president of the Long Island, New York section of the American Nuclear Society. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Originally, when we were putting this session together, I reached out to Liz Matson, chair of the Chicago section, who was happy to join us. Then A&S National heard about the topic and was very interested. So I would like to thank Tracy Coyle from A&S National, that is the American Nuclear Society, who provided us with this expanded webinar platform. We're very excited to present tonight's talk featuring Dr. Jack Shlachter of Brookhaven National Laboratory. During the talk, please use the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen, sending your questions to Dina, our section VP, who will relay the questions to Jack at the end of this talk. Now I would like to introduce the speaker. Rabbi Dr. Jack Shlachter, or better simply Jack, was an undergraduate at Caltech and a graduate student in physics at the University of California at San Diego. After receiving his PhD as an experimental plasma physicist, he was hired full-time at Los Alamos National Laboratory in northern New Mexico, where he spent the bulk of his scientific career. Jack's research began in magnetic fusion and involved the exploration of novel pulse systems for producing nuclear energy. At Los Alamos, Jack worked on a variety of large pulse power machines and magnetic flux compression generators. During the last half of his Los Alamos career, Jack served in several management positions, including leading the experimental physics division and later the theoretical division. In parallel with his scientific career, Jack received rabbinic ordination in June 1995 and has served a number of Jewish congregations around the world, including the expatriate Jewish community in Beijing, China. For many years, he provided part-time rabbinic support to the Los Alamos Jewish Center, where he is now Rabbi Emeritus. And he also served a congregation in Santa Fe, New Mexico, until this fall, 2019, when he and his wife, Beverly, relocated to Eastern Long Island, New York. Jack is honored to currently serve as the rabbi of the Jewish Center of Moriches in Center Moriches, New York, while working full-time at Brookhaven National Laboratory. Upon joining Los Alamos Theoretical Division as a covert experimentalist, Jack began studying the history of that illustrious organization and was struck by the preponderance of Jews who comprised the division during its inception in the Manhattan Project. It was this observation that resulted in the materials he'll present this evening. Jack, we're thrilled to have you join us tonight, and thank you for sharing your research with us.
It's my pleasure, Ed. Thank you very much. And I'm going to go ahead and start sharing screen, and you'll let me know if something goes awry here. But this is what I want to show. And we should see my title slide, hopefully, which should say Jews in Theory, Jews at Los Alamos, New Mexico during the Manhattan Project. And I'm very pleased to be giving this talk. I've given variants of this talk over the years. This was the title slide that I prepared just before the pandemic. And so we're going to cross out the date because that went by the wayside. And because we're doing this in a webinar format, we're going to cross out the Long Island section because this went to American Nuclear Society as a whole. But more substantively, let me cross that out in the title because I'm going to use kind of a loose definition of Jews for the presentation. Many of the people that I will talk about had a Jewish mother, which is sort of the technical way by which somebody can become Jewish, but they probably didn't really identify much. And so we're going to cross that out also because I did not focus exclusively on the theoretical division, but the title is actually a pun because I think the theme that I'm going to try to bring out is that these people were really Jews in theory. So while the talk started out as focused on theoretical division, it was intended to mean that they were Jews in theoretical division, but they really were Jews not in practice, but in theory. So let me do one more thing here mechanically, and I'm just going to Let's see if I can do this correctly. Uh-oh, maybe not. Well, let me not worry about that then. Let's just go back. Oh, I know what I have to do. Let me kill that. Hang on just 1 second. This is the only mechanics that was going to throw me off. After that, I think we'll be okay. So I'm going to shift gears because I had this long career at Los Alamos, but I am now at Brookhaven National Laboratory. So what you saw as my background originally was the Brookhaven National Lab, and I'm going to shift gears now, and hopefully, if you still see me, you should see Los Alamos in the background there, and that's going to stay with us for the rest of the talk because really the focus is going to be on Los Alamos. Let me tell you a little bit about the organization of the talk. I'm going to give a little bit of background about the Manhattan Project. So this was the project that developed the first atomic bomb. Right now is a very special anniversary season. July 16th, just last week, a week ago today, was the 75th anniversary of the first test of an atomic bomb that was called the Trinity test, conducted in southern New Mexico. But Los Alamos was set up in 1943 as the R&D enterprise for designing and constructing the first bomb. It was not the only part of the Manhattan Project. In fact, the vast number of people who worked on the Manhattan Project were not in Los Alamos. They were in large, and I mean really large, factory complexes to make the materials for the bombs, one in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and one in Washington State. But the design of the bomb and the assembly was done in Los Alamos. And so that was kind of the brains of the Manhattan Project. So when I came into theoretical division as sort of a covert experimentalist, I had spent many years working at Los Alamos, but I really didn't know much about the history of Los Alamos. I mean, I knew that Los Alamos was the center of the Manhattan Project, but I really didn't know much about the history of Los Alamos. And I came into theoretical division. It was now about 10 years ago when I joined that organization. And this roster was on the door of my boss. And I'm going to try to blow this up a little bit for you. Let's see if that works. And so you'll see there's a bunch of names here. Some of them, if I can move like a cursor around, you'll see have this designation of T/something, T/4, T/3 over here, T/5. These individuals were part of what we call the Special Engineering Detachment. They were basically soldiers with some college degree. But many of the other names, so the non-soldiers, if you will, those individuals were names that I recognized as being very famous physicists. And I came into the division, and this roster from May 10th, 1945, which was 2 days after VE Day, that roster was on my boss's door. He was the division leader of theoretical division. I came in as the deputy division leader, and it was quite an intimidating roster. It was like every famous physicist you'd ever heard of. And on top of that, it struck me that many of these people seemed to be Jewish names. And so I started looking into this, and it's just kind of, as a proud Jewish person, I often look to see, was somebody Jewish? But as I said with my title, they probably were really Jews in theory, not so much observant Jews as we might think of that today. But that's getting a little bit ahead of myself. I want to give you a little bit of background in the first part of this talk about the Manhattan Project. And then I'm going to focus in on this division, on theoretical division. And then the last part of the talk, I'll branch out a little bit to some of the other scientists who were at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project. And basically everybody I'm going to mention has a strong connection to Judaism, and we're not going to worry about the details of were they really Jewish or not. But let's go on to the history of the Manhattan Project. So the Manhattan Project ran between basically 1942 and 1945, and it started off with a letter that was composed, and here you see Albert Einstein, and this individual, another physicist, Leo Szilard. This is a staged photograph. They composed this letter in 1939. I don't know that they knew where history was going to take them. This was a staged photograph for a documentary that was made in 1946. But it was a very important thing that this letter was written. So it was, my understanding is that Einstein listened to Szilard explain some of the concerns that Szilard had about the Germans might be able to make a weapon, an atomic weapon. And Einstein captured that concern. Szilard realized that Szilard, as an unknown scientist, couldn't get the attention of anybody of importance. The original plan was to try to get in touch with the royalty in Belgium and try to control the flow of uranium to the Germans. But in fact, the decision was made fairly early on as they were iterating on the letter that instead they should send the letter to President Roosevelt. And so what you see is this letter that went to President Roosevelt. And for the Long Island chapter, I did a little more research. And if you look at the return address, this was a summer cottage that Einstein was living in for 2 summers, but in particular, the summer of 1939, he was spending out on Long Island. And he composed this letter with Szilard. Actually, Szilard didn't drive, and so Eugene Wigner had to drive Szilard out to Einstein. They drove out from Princeton, and then the letter was iterated, and so on a subsequent trip, Edward Teller had to drive Szilard out to visit with Einstein. And Edward Teller, whom we're going to come across at the end of this talk, Teller, in a rare moment of humility, said that he entered history as Szilard's chauffeur. But Wigner was the first chauffeur, Teller was the second chauffeur, and the letter is known as the Einstein-Szilard letter. Now, this letter was signed, as I said, somewhere out on the North Fork of Long Island. But what about these 4 individuals that I've now mentioned? Einstein, Szilard, Teller, and Wigner. All 4 were Jewish. They were also all from Axis countries. And so that's a theme that's going to come up a lot in this talk. By the way, Wigner went on to win the Nobel Prize in 1963. But at this point in 1939, Einstein was already probably the most famous scientist in the world. He had won the Nobel Prize in 1921. And so this letter initiated US interest in developing an atomic bomb. But the letter, if you read it carefully, it's not the thing that really got the Manhattan Project going in great, and you can see there's a long delay, 1939 until 1942, a lot happened. And why was it that this letter didn't have such a huge effect on getting everything going? Because in this letter, it was conceived that the bomb would be something that a ship could carry and park in the harbor of a city and then blow up and cause a lot of damage. However, there was another letter that was written, and I'm going to talk about this one as part of history as well. And this letter is known as the Frisch-Peierls Memorandum. This was composed in England, and it was composed a little bit later than the Szilard-Einstein letter. This was in March of 1940. But this letter, unlike the other one, this letter went into some calculational detail about how big an atomic bomb would be. And in this memorandum, it was clear that a bomb could be carried by a plane. That was a game changer. And that's really when it was recognized that, that you could make a bomb deliverable by a plane, then the whole situation changed. And that really got the Manhattan Project going. Frisch and Peierls, also both Jewish, and I'll talk about them in a little more detail. But suffice it to say that these 2 letters really had a huge effect. And the British combined their forces with the US, and they sent a team of scientists to Los Alamos. And Frisch and Pyrals were both part of that team, and we're going to talk about them as part of the Los Alamos contingent. But now let's focus in on Los Alamos. So when the Manhattan Project was really set up, this individual, J. Robert Oppenheimer, was selected as the scientific leader of the project. The military really ran the Manhattan Project. In fact, the reason it was called the Manhattan Project is because the Army Corps of Engineers had an office in Manhattan, New York, and that was the office out of which things really were directed until things really got going in Los Alamos. So General Leslie Groves was the military head of the project, and he ended up selecting J. Robert Oppenheimer to lead the scientific effort. Now, a few comments about Oppenheimer. So Oppenheimer, you can see I put birth dates on here, and just keep in mind that we're talking about basically 1943 to 1945. So not yet 40 years old when he was leading the Los Alamos project. In this little inset picture that I put down here, you see Oppenheimer in his very iconic pork pie hat. That's part of my theme about Jews in theory. Oppenheimer was a non-observant Jew, so I like the idea that it was a pork pie hat because observant Jews would not be eating pork. That's just a little bit of a joke, but in this picture, as well as seeing Oppenheimer and his pork pie hat, you also see another individual who's helping to rig up what became the Trinity test. So this photograph was taken basically July 15th of 1945 as the Trinity device was being hoisted up into its tower. And the individual who's shown here in the right of this inset is Louis Slotin, who would go on to die tragically in a criticality experiment in 1946, also a Jewish scientist, Louis Slotin. He was part of the, he was Canadian, and he was part of the British contingent. But what about Oppenheimer? Oppenheimer knew about New Mexico because he had visited there when he was a late teen, and he loved the desert country of New Mexico, and he loved physics. Those were his two great loves. Very fascinating individual, different from most people you might come across. I'll just share with you one anecdote about him. During the 1920s, so he would have been in his 20s, early 20s, he remained aloof from worldly matters, and he claimed he did not read newspapers or listen to the radio, and only learned about the Wall Street crash of 1929 some 6 months after it occurred while he was out on a walk with another scientist. So Oppenheimer, brilliant scientist, an excellent manager for the laboratory, a little bit different, if you will. Oppenheimer was put in charge of the scientific effort, and he woefully underestimated what would be involved. He thought that 50 scientists and 50 technicians is all you would need. General Groves tripled that number and said, no, we really need a place for 300 people. The actual population, including family members of Los Alamos, was 3,500 people in 1943, 5,700 people by the end of 1944, and 8,200 people by the end of 1945. So it was a much more massive effort than Oppenheimer originally anticipated. And Oppenheimer was a theorist. And so his original organization chart for the laboratory was to have 4 divisions, 4 technical divisions, one of which was experimental physics division, and one of which was theoretical division. And then one was chemistry and metallurgy, and the other one was ordnance. And Oppenheimer planned to be dual-hatted. He was going to be the lab director, but also be the head of theoretical division. And his friends said, that's crazy, don't do that. And so he ended up selecting somebody else to be the head of theoretical division. So theoretical division exists today. Its original mission was to calculate the critical mass to decide how much material would be needed for a bomb. And then later on, it shifted so that theoretical division was involved in trying to understand the hydrodynamics of implosion, to understand how to make an implosion system work. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But it exists today. It's the only division that was there since 1943 continuously to today. And now theoretical division alone employs 300 some people. So quite a big organization. But here's that org chart from 1945. And in this org chart, a bunch of things jump out. So first of all, these four individuals who are circled in gold all went on to win Nobel Prizes in physics. So nobody in this organization had a Nobel Prize at the time of the Manhattan Project, but these four individuals went on to win Nobel Prizes. So we're going to learn a little bit about each of them. They were all Jewish, by the way. And it's not so easy by looking at names, and you can tell you don't even see the first name, you just see an initial, but it's not easy to figure out who's Jewish and who's not. And there's also, by the way, one known spy here. This is Klaus Fuchs here, who was the section leader in Group T1. There's also a few women, because you can't tell that from first names here, but I managed to find out that there are at least 3 women on this chart, and that was interesting when I was trying to promote increased number of women in theoretical division. One of those women is actually down here. That's Mitzi Teller. That was Edward Teller's wife. She was in the division. But if we go on, I looked at the leadership of T Division, and by my count, it was something like, all 3 members of the division office, as well as basically 5 out of 7 unique name individuals as the group leaders, and several of the alternate group leaders as well. So the division had a fair number of Jews. I would estimate maybe on the order of 25%, but the leadership was overwhelmingly Jewish. And I'm going to walk through sort of name by name with one slide each of these individuals, because one is as colorful as the next, and they're all fascinating individuals. And I'll just point out, you can't really tell from names about who's Jewish and who's not. The second name on Group T1, Bob Christie, he's a person that I knew when I was at Caltech, because he was the vice president and provost of Caltech when I was an undergraduate there. And Bob Christie, that name is absolutely not one you'd associate with a Jewish person, but he was born Robert Cohen, and his family changed their name when Bob Christie was. So actually, there's a lot of Jews on here, and it's quite interesting to me to find out about these individuals. The senior people are the ones who became the leaders. And what does it mean that they were senior? It meant that they were in their mid-30s, not their early 30s or late 20s. These are really young scientists, I have to say. The only one on here that I know of who was in his 40s, and he was really only 40 at the time of this roster, is von Neumann, who was a consultant. But the regular employees here were basically all in their 30s. In fact, one of these individuals, one of the group leaders, Richard Feynman, turned 27 the day after this roster was posted. So 26 years old as a group leader there. So what about these individuals? And I'm going to walk through them in order. So here was the division leader of theoretical division when it was formed in 1943, Hans Bethe. And you can see foreign born, and again from an Axis country. He had to escape Europe because he lost his job. His mother was Jewish. I believe she may have converted. I don't know for sure. Hans himself was, to the best of my knowledge, raised as a Protestant like his father was. So again, it's that Jews in theory theme. But Hans Bethe went on to win the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1967. I got to hear him speak at Los Alamos. And then I also got to speak at a memorial service in Los Alamos when Hans's widow and child came for a memorial service in Los Alamos. I got to speak because at the time I was the division leader of physics division. Hans Bethe could have been the leader of the scientific effort. His name was put forward to General Groves. People were unanimous that they thought he could do a great job as the scientific leader, but he was unacceptable to Groves because he was foreign born from an Axis country. And that was just too dangerous a thing as far as Groves was concerned. Hans Bethe had a wonderful sense of humor. He and two other authors, as postdocs, wrote a hoax paper that they managed to get published in 1931. It was entitled On the Quantum Theory of the Temperature of Absolute Zero, and they purport to calculate the fine structure constant from the absolute zero temperature in Celsius units. And when it was realized that this was a hoax, they had to issue an apology. It's quite an entertaining short note. But this from a memoir by one of the group leaders in theoretical division, from Joe Hirschfelder's memoir. He said, unlike Oppenheimer, Bethe was a jolly fellow. My office was down the hall, and I could always tell when Bethe and Feynman were working together because there would be frequent bursts of guffaws and belly laughs. When there was a comic moving picture in the base theater, you could always tell by the laughter whether Bethe was in the audience. So a really entertaining, charming individual, well-liked, and as I say, went on to win the Nobel Prize in Physics. The deputy division leader of theoretical division, also Jewish, Victor Weisskopf, Vicky as he was known, he was born into a comfortable middle-class family in Vienna. So again, he had to come to the United States to get away from the persecution that was taking place in the 1930s. And he came to the United States in 1937. But it was getting hard to come to the United States. He was an Austrian Jew. He knew he had to leave Europe, but that was easier said than done. There were very few positions open anywhere, and many outstanding physicists anticipated a Nazi onslaught, and they were competing for these positions. So Vicky Weisskopf decided that it would help if he published something in nuclear physics. It's not the field that he knew, but he decided to learn it really quickly. That was the new rage. And he also realized that if he published the paper in English, it would help a lot. So he learned English also. So lickety-split, he learned nuclear physics and English, published the paper, was able to secure a position in the United States, and his life was saved. He was an interesting individual, as were all of these. I hate to repeat myself on that, but I really have basically tremendous admiration for any of these people. Weisskopf was invited to be Hans Bethe's deputy for theoretical division. He was known for his physics intuition, and experimentalists always used to come to his office to get kind of his gut feel for the answer to something. As a result, he was one of the few theorists who was invited to go down to witness the Trinity test in southern New Mexico. And after the Trinity test, he said, our first feeling was one of elation. Then we realized we were extremely tired, and then we were worried. So that was July 16th, 1945. And of course, just a few weeks later, the bomb was dropped on first Hiroshima on August 6th, and then on Nagasaki on August 9th. Victor Weisskopf grew up, as I said, in Vienna. He loved music, and he also loved physics. He often said that his two favorite occupations were Mozart and quantum mechanics. So a wonderful combination there. And I liked this pair of photographs because, to me, I liked to think when I was in the division office in theoretical division that a few years in the division office aged you tremendously. And so I often would pretend that that was what he looked like when he came in, and 2 years later, that's what he looked like when he left theoretical division. He did go on to direct CERN, a very famous European laboratory, and you may know about CERN because of the discovery of the Higgs boson. The last of the individuals in the division office proper was the consultant, who I said was actually in his early 40s at the time of the roster. This was Johnny von Neumann. Von Neumann was a child prodigy. You can see that it says by the age of 6, he could exchange jokes in classical Greek. But even more than that, he could divide two 8-digit numbers in his head at the age of 6. By the age of 8, he had mastered calculus. By the age of 12, he was doing graduate level mathematics. And he had a broad range of cultural interests. He was a fluent Latin and Greek scholar. He loved ancient history. He knew Byzantine history, and a professor of Byzantine history once said that von Neumann had greater expertise on the subject than he, the professor, had. Von Neumann took great care in his dressing. You see him often in a three-piece suit in these pictures. I actually found a YouTube video where you can hear his voice. It's quite interesting to listen to him talk. Hungarian accent comes through very clearly. Von Neumann was a notoriously bad driver, and nevertheless he enjoyed driving frequently while reading a book, which occasioned many arrests and many accidents. He had one car accident and he reported it this way. He said, "I was proceeding down the road. The trees on the right were passing me in orderly fashion at 60 miles an hour. Suddenly, one of them stepped into my path." Very witty individual. When he was at Princeton, he received complaints because he was regularly playing extremely loud German marching music on his gramophone, which distracted those in the neighboring offices, including Einstein. Otto Frisch, who was the co-author of the Frisch-Peierls memo from that helped start the Manhattan Project, Frisch once suggested to von Neumann that von Neumann consider using vacuum tubes instead of mechanical cogwheels to make a computer. Von Neumann was very influential in the development of numerical computing. And when Frisch made this comment about using tubes, von Neumann launched into a 5-hour nonstop lecture about computers, stopped to get a beer before the pub closed, and then went on to lecture for 2 more hours. He really was a prodigious brain. It is said that he died under military security because he was under heavy sedation, and it was feared that he would share some military secrets as he was dying. So that's it for the division office. I'm going to move on now to the group leaders. The first group, Group T1, was led by Sir Rudolph Peierls. So this was the co-author as well of the Frisch-Peierls memo. And you see that he was knighted. He was a British subject. He was born in Berlin, and he came to Cambridge University in England when Hitler came to power. And that saved his life. He was on a Rockefeller scholarship. Peierls, I believe, had quite a sense of humor as well. The Rockefeller Foundation insisted that he tell them of the results of his work. And so when Peierls' daughter was born, Peierls sent the birth announcement to the Rockefeller Foundation and said, "Here are the results of my work." And they apparently were not very amused. He went on to have a great career in physics. He was the pioneer of the concept of holes in semiconductors, and his contributions in the Manhattan Project were great, not just in starting the Manhattan Project off, but he was part of that team that came to the United States. He recognized that blast wave equations had the same form as implosion equations, and so he was able to apply that to studying implosions. That's why he headed the implosion theory group. T2 was led by Bob Serber. This is the first of our American-born scientists from T Division whom I'm going to discuss. And you see that he was born in Philadelphia, very left-leaning circles in Philadelphia, as was the case for Jews in the early part of the 20th century. He was very close to Oppenheimer. He went to the University of California at Berkeley, where Oppenheimer was, and he could not get a permanent position there. The chair of the physics department at Berkeley said 1 Jew on the faculty is enough. So with Oppenheimer, there were no other opportunities for Serber, and so Serber ended up at the University of Illinois, but he stayed in close connection to Oppenheimer, and as a result, Oppenheimer brought him early on to Los Alamos, and Serber introduced all the scientists who came with everything that was known about the bomb project, because he knew it all from having been so close to Oppenheimer. And you see that there's a declassified version of that called the Los Alamos Primer, which were the lectures that Serber gave to the individuals when they showed up at Los Alamos. And here's a description of him. This comes from the book Lawrence and Oppenheimer by Newell Farr Davis. A lean, dark, inconspicuous wisp of a man, Serber hated dramatics. While talking, he stumbled continually over his words and swallowed impatiently as though he had dust from the mesa lodged in his throat, but felt his subject too trivial to justify a sip of water. Nevertheless, he held his audience. He wasn't much of a speaker, but for ammunition, he had everything Oppenheimer's theoretical group had uncovered during the last year. He knew it all cold, and that was all he cared about. So, a wonderful description of this individual. And before we leave this slide, I just included Charlotte Serber on there, his wife. She was the only female group leader at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project. She headed the technical library, and Oppenheimer felt that that was an important aspect of a scientific project. Here's T4's group leader, Richard Feynman, probably the most well-known name to people outside of the physics world. He went on to win the Nobel Prize in 1965. I had the privilege of taking a full-year class from Feynman when I was an undergraduate at Caltech. Just an amazing individual. I recommend, if you're looking for some entertainment, just pull up one of the recorded video lectures that he gave in, I believe, the late 50s. Absolutely entertaining, wonderful talks. According to Feynman's mother, Feynman couldn't decide whether he wanted to be a comedian or a scientist, so he combined the two options. I think that's a wonderful description of him. When he applied to be a graduate student at Princeton, the committee said they had never before seen anyone whose scores were that good in math and physics on the aptitude tests, and they had never before admitted anyone whose scores in history and English were that low. Feynman, in that lower right picture, is familiar to many people because of his investigation of the Challenger accident, and in 1986 he was filmed freezing an O-ring in ice water to show that the O-rings had become brittle, or at least lost their flexibility, and that contributed to the accident. Here's a description in Feynman's own words of his first professional seminar as a graduate student at Princeton. His thesis advisor, Wheeler, said, "Feynman, you're a young fella. You should give a seminar on this. You need experience in giving talks." So it was to be my first technical talk, and my thesis advisor, Wheeler, made arrangements with Wigner, and you'll remember him as one of the chauffeurs for the Einstein-Szilard letter, with Wigner to put it on the regular seminar schedule. A day or two before the talk, I saw Wigner in the hall. "Feynman," he said, "I think that work you're doing with Wheeler is very interesting, so I've invited Russell to the seminar." Henry Norris Russell, the famous great astronomer of the day, was coming to the lecture. Wigner went on, "I think Professor von Neumann would also be interested. Von Neumann was the greatest mathematician around. And Professor Pauli is visiting from Switzerland, it so happens, so I've invited Professor Pauli to come." Pauli was a very famous physicist, and by this time I'm turning yellow. Finally, Wigner said, "Professor Einstein only rarely comes to our weekly seminars, but your work is so interesting that I've invited him specially, so he's coming too." By this time, I must have turned green because Wigner said, No, don't worry. I'll just warn you though, if Professor Russell falls asleep, and he will undoubtedly fall asleep, it doesn't mean that the seminar is bad. He falls asleep in all the seminars. On the other hand, if Professor Pauli is nodding all the time, it seems to be in agreement as the seminar goes along. Don't pay attention. Professor Pauli has palsy. So Feynman shares that with us from his 20s, but by the time he was about 25 years old, he was already in Los Alamos, and he went on to become a group leader for the following reason, and he shared this with us. He said, all the big shots were gone one day except for Hans Bethe, and Bethe needed someone to talk about, so he invited me into his office, and I was just a little squirt, and he's explaining his idea, and I said, "No, you're crazy, it'll go like this." And Bethe patiently said, "No, I'm not crazy, it'll go like this." And then Feynman said, "No, you're crazy." And it turns out that even though Feynman realized this was a little bit rude, what Bethe realized is this guy's not afraid to explain things from his perspective. So he became a group leader with 4 people underneath him. And maybe one last anecdote about Feynman, because we could spend the whole evening talking about him. It says that when he was heading off to Los Alamos, everybody was told to be very careful and not to buy their train tickets in Princeton, because Princeton was a very small station. And if everybody was buying train tickets to New Mexico from Princeton, somebody would get suspicious. So everybody bought their tickets somewhere else. But I figured if they're all buying it somewhere else, I'm going to buy it from Princeton. So I went to the train station and said, I want to go to New Mexico. And the guy said, oh, so all this stuff is for you. And it turns out that even though everybody bought their tickets from somewhere else, they shipped all the equipment from Princeton, and nobody could quite figure out why all this stuff was going to New Mexico until Feynman showed up and bought his ticket to New Mexico. So he solved that mystery for them. The next group leader, Joseph Hirschfelder, this is T7 now, if I'm remembering correctly. I'm just going to share with you that he was a giant in theoretical chemistry for many, many years, wrote one of the real important books on the subject. And at the Trinity test, he said the following, I think quite poetically. He said, all of a sudden, the night turned into day, the chill turned into warmth. The fireball gradually turned from white to yellow to red as it grew in size and climbed into the sky, and the air filled with a purple glow, just as though we were surrounded by an aurora borealis. The last group leader on the list here is this individual, George Placzek. George Placzek was the group leader of T8, and he was born in Bohemia, Brno, in Bohemia, and he spent many years wandering around in Europe. And it was said that he was Bohemian both by birth and in his characteristic wanderings. You see that he ended up at one point in at Hebrew University, when it was formed. He was the very first physics faculty member of Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He learned Hebrew so that he could deliver his lectures in Hebrew, but he didn't hit it off with the management at all. They thought they would hire a theorist to be the first physicist on the faculty because they thought it would be cheap. What would they need to do other than pay for chalk? And he said, no, you need to have experiments and you need to have equipment and all that. And he didn't hit it off with them, so he was only there for one academic year. And then he wandered elsewhere. You see that he wandered to the Soviet Union and then eventually came to the United States. He lost many relatives from the Holocaust. And his grandfather was not only a rabbi, but he had a scientific life as well, which I find quite interesting, a rabbi with a scientific life. And his grandfather had a correspondence both with Darwin and with Gregor Mendel. And that was the inspiration for George Placzek's scientific background. And just two anecdotes about him, because I really enjoyed him. It's said when he was wandering around, he was in Germany at one point, he liked a good argument. And there was a swimming pool in Leipzig where he would go swimming, where he wanted to go swimming, and the attendant sent him back because Placzek was wearing what was a new fashion, namely swimming trunks, as opposed to a men's swimming outfit, with the top and bottom. And the attendant said he had to go back, that men had to wear full swimsuits. And Placzek pointed to some bathers, some men, who had one shoulder strap undone and half of their chest was uncovered. And the attendant said, that's all right, as long as one side is covered. And Placzek said, is that really the only rule? And the attendant said, yes. So the next day, Placzek came and he took a full-size swimsuit and he bisected it vertically so it only covered his right half. And he called that following the letter of the law. One other anecdote about his time in the Soviet Union, he and Weizsäcker made this trip in the late 30s to the Soviet Union, and Placzek had a list of things he wanted to bring to their Soviet friends, including a large quantity of condoms. And since he was a very generous person, he bought about 1,000 of them. And then he met up with Weizsäcker to assemble all the goods in the apartment. And he had all these packages, and he started to unpack the boxes, and he had chocolate and slide rules and tissues and soaps. And then he hit his head hit his forehead with the palm of his hand, and he said, "Oh no, the Copenhagen taxi trade is going to die out." And nobody knew what he was talking about, but he said, "I forgot the box with the condoms in the taxi." So he ran off to buy another box of condoms. Now, to complete T division, there were two more Nobel Prize winners. They weren't managers in the division. They were just working stiff staff members. They were Fred Reines and Roy Glauber. They were both Jewish as well. So again, all four of the future Nobel Prize winners were Jewish. Fred Reines, I heard speak once, and Roy Glauber, I got to spend half an hour talking to him when he came to give a talk at Los Alamos. He won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2005. Reines won it in 1995. And both of them, in their Nobel Prize acceptance speeches, had something fun to say, I thought. So here's Reines. He said, "The first stirrings of interest in science that I remember occurred when I was in Hebrew school. And I was reading that thinking, oh, great, somebody's really attached to their Judaism." And he said, "No, it was during a moment of boredom. And I looked out the window and it was twilight. And I made a little telescope with my hand and looked out the window. And I saw this strange phenomenon, which was diffraction. And so I started to get interested in science because I was bored in Hebrew school." Roy Glauber, in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, said something very interesting. So he was quite a prodigy. He graduated from the Bronx High School of Science probably at the age of 15, and he went on to Harvard. He had been in his sophomore year at Harvard, and he was recruited as an 18-year-old to come to Los Alamos. As an 18-year-old scientist, he was recruited to come to Los Alamos, and he worked on the project as a scientist. And at the end of the war, he had to go back to Harvard to finish his undergraduate degree. And he said in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech that was surprisingly difficult because even though I needed a few classes to graduate, I had had a team of assistants do the calculations for me at Los Alamos. And now back at school to do my homework, I had to do it all by myself. So I think he had a rude awakening back in school. So this is the last individual from T division I want to mention. This individual was a soldier scientist. He had an undergraduate degree. No, I'm sorry, he was an undergraduate, or maybe he had his degree at the time, but he was recruited as a soldier, not as a scientist. And a professor approached him. Oh, so I guess he was still in school. Professor approached him, and the professor said, "There's this mystery program. Do you want to enlist and be in that service unit? You wouldn't leave the United States. We can't tell you what it's all about." And he agreed to participate. And I know about this because Murray Peshkin, I spoke to on the phone. I tracked him down. He was in Feynman's group. He told me that it was fortuitous that he was in Feynman's group because he, of all the people in the large computing group, had asked that if he knew what they were trying to compute, he could maybe speed it up. And he was told, "We can't tell you what we're trying to compute because you don't have a clearance." And he said, "Well, then get me a clearance." So they got him a clearance. It didn't help him figure out what they were trying to compute. But when Feynman said he needed another person in the group, Peshkin was the only one with a clearance. And so he ended up working for Feynman. Peshkin told me some things about Jewish life in Los Alamos during the war, but it basically was, there really wasn't much of an active Jewish life from what he could tell. Now, I'm going to shift gears for the tail end of the talk, and I promise you I'll get through this in not too much longer. But outside of T division, we have equally fascinating individuals. It wasn't my original talk when I got interested in this topic, but I expanded it a bit. So I want to shift, because I am an experimentalist by training, to tell you a little bit about some experimentalists. And here you see the elegant experimental facilities that they had during the war. This was the Pond Cabin, which was built in 1914 as a guest ranch for well-heeled city folk who were looking for an adventure in the Wild West. And it was commandeered by Los Alamos scientists to be part of the Manhattan Project. And you can see the assembly that was set up there to do some experiments. Now, here's one individual, and you see him with some experimental apparatus, not what was done at the war, but this is later. This was Felix Bloch, a Jewish scientist who went on to win the Nobel Prize in 1952. But his connection with Los Alamos is quite tenuous. He was only there from the summer of 1943 to November of 1943 because he just didn't like the military atmosphere and he didn't think the work was that interesting. So he left and worked on radar instead. Another future Nobel Prize winning individual from the experimental side was Emilio Segre. His background is a little different from the other ones we heard. Pretty much, as best I can tell, the other Jewish scientists we've talked about were what we call Ashkenazic Jews. They came from sort of the East European background or Middle Europe, but Segre was of Sephardic descent. He came from the Jews of the Mediterranean area, and his grandfather was the architect of the magnificent Florence synagogue, and Segre had a huge effect on the war project because it was first thought that plutonium would be used in a gun-type nuclear weapon just like uranium was. Hence, Little Boy and Thin Man was going to be the plutonium bomb. But Segre found out that you couldn't use plutonium in that way. It was too slow a joining of the critical masses, and it would dud. And so he realized that this back burner project at Los Alamos of trying to implode plutonium turned out to be the required way to get plutonium to work. And the whole laboratory reorganized as a result of this. Several new divisions were stood up. The effort that had just been a few scientists doing implosion work now became an enormous effort. Half the lab was trying to solve the implosion problem, and that all came about because of Segre. And let me go on then to some people who had a role to play in the implosion project. So here you see the experiment that was done testing implosions not with plutonium, but with surrogate materials. And how would they test the implosions? They had to make a radiograph, but they didn't have, huge X-ray sources. They had to use a radioactive source. And here you see these two individuals doing remote handling, remote meaning they're pulling a rope here, remote handling of the largest radioactive source that had ever been anywhere in the world at that time. This was a kilocurie source of radiolanthanum, and it was an enormously, probably the most important experiment that was ever done to design the plutonium bomb, was to do these implosion tests with a radioactive source. And I learned as part of my work here at Brookhaven that the individual in the front here, the first of the individuals to the right, is actually a scientist who I'll talk about in just a second. The individual behind him was a woman. So I think that's also a very wonderful thing to realize that women had very important roles in the project. So who was the individual in the front? It was this individual on the left, Gerhard Friedlander. He ended up at Brookhaven, and he played a huge role in the Manhattan Project. As you can see, he was very instrumental in that experiment. And as a Jew, he hadn't been allowed to attend university under the Nazis, and instead he became a laboratory technician in Germany. So when he was able to come to the United States, he was able to exercise his full scientific abilities and became an important scientist, and then went on to have an illustrious career at Brookhaven. Also, this individual, I learned, Seymour Kapkoff, went on to win a medal from the American Nuclear Society, and I thought I wanted to share that with you. He also was at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project and went on to have a career at Brookhaven in the chemistry department. So I inserted this slide because of the importance of Brookhaven in my current life. This individual was in charge of those experiments, Bruno Rossi. He also was Jewish. And he was the one who developed those techniques, probably not single-handedly, but he had a lot to do with this radiolanthanide approach to measuring implosions. He went on to have a very important career, as did many of these others. His experimental equipment, what we call Rossi oscilloscopes, were still used at Los Alamos in the 1990s. So he had developed something many, many years earlier that went on to be used later. This individual, one that I just learned a little more about recently, I remember going to a wonderful talk that he gave at Los Alamos. Philip Morrison, a Jewish scientist who was at Los Alamos during the war. You may know of him from a very wonderful layperson video called Powers of 10. And he also made a series of PBS shows called The Ring of Truth. Very excellent science communicator as well as scientist. And he actually transported the core of the Trinity test bomb down to southern New Mexico to the test site in the back seat of a Dodge sedan. So I learned about that recently too. Otto Frisch we came across, he was an experimentalist, but we came across him because he worked on the Frisch-Peierls memo. Here you see him facing in a spliced photograph his aunt, Lisa Meitner. Lisa Meitner, you could easily argue, was robbed of the Nobel Prize, both of them Jewish, of course. He grew up in Vienna. He was the son, Otto Frisch was the son of a painter and concert pianist. He was talented at both of those, but he got very interested in physics because of his aunt's love of physics. By the way, I have a challenge to my wife to make for me a pair of socks with Lisa Meitner's image on them. So keep that in mind if you want to buy me a birthday present someday. Frisch was a very interesting character in his own right. And I know something about him, not because I ever met him or heard him speak, but because the SED, the Special Engineering Detachment soldier who was assigned to work with Frisch, was a member in long standing of the Jewish community in Los Alamos. It was a soldier who then became a scientist named Jay Wexler, who was basically the founder of the Jewish community in Los Alamos. And he shared many stories about Frisch because he worked closely with him during the Manhattan Project. Just one Frisch anecdote. Frisch had a lively social life, but he was absent-minded, and he once had to have an announcement at Los Alamos made over the paging system. Will the person who invited Otto Frisch to dinner please let him know who you are? So that was Frisch. Edward Teller, also Jewish, doesn't get a lot of attention here because I was a Los Alamosan for so many years, and his name was mud in Los Alamos because of his testimony in the Oppenheimer security clearance hearing. I did get to hear Teller speak, though he was a little bit rehabilitated late in his life. He was not in theoretical division in that roster that I showed, not because he wasn't a theorist, but because he couldn't get along with anybody. He was so interested in working on his own ideas, he couldn't be told what to work on. So Oppenheimer shunted him off to his own organization to work on what Teller wanted to work on, which was the thermonuclear device, not the atomic bomb. And he worked on it with this individual, the Jewish scientist Stan Ulam. And Stan Ulam, after the Trinity test, said, "You could see it on their faces. I saw that something very grave and strong had happened to their whole outlook on the future." He was a brilliant mathematician, and it was said of him by Otto Frisch that Ulam was a pure mathematician who once sunk so low that his paper actually, his latest published paper actually contained numbers with decimal points. What a terrible thing. Then just a few more individuals and we're done. Rabbi was not officially part of the Manhattan Project, but he consulted at the lab. He told Oppenheimer, you don't want to make this a military project. You need the scientists to be civilians. And that changed the whole character, not just of Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project era, but for all time since then, that it was a civilian scientist-run effort, not a military effort. Rabbi was influential in the course of physics in this country in an enormous way. You see, he was somewhat older than the others. He did his training in Europe, as did all scientists, all physicists at the time. And Rabbi went on to win the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1944. But even maybe more important than that, he established physics as a first-class discipline in the United States so that people could do their training in the United States. And really that had a profound effect. The last individual I want to mention is this individual, Sir Joseph Rotblat. You see from the Sir that he had a connection to the British Empire. He actually left Warsaw, left Poland. He was invited to work in Liverpool with the great scientist Chadwick, the discoverer of the neutron, who went on to win the Nobel Prize for the discovery of the neutron. Rotblat was invited to go to Liverpool, and he left Warsaw in late August 1939. And you know that World War II started September 1st with the invasion of Poland. Rotblat's wife was ill at the time, and the plan was for her to follow him a few days after he left. And she was on the other side of that September 1st deadline. She couldn't get out. And through the course of the war, Rotblat tried desperately to get her out of, well, actually, yes, that's right, through the course of the war, both during his time in Europe, and then he came as part of the British contingent to Los Alamos, but he continued struggling to get her out through any means he could come up with, and he was not able to get her out. She perished in the Holocaust. He never saw her again, and he was a very principled individual. I think they kept the news from him that his wife was almost certainly dead because they were afraid of his leaving the project. But in fact, he found out that, at least according to General Groves, the bomb was really being developed to subdue the Soviets. At least this is what I have read that he heard. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. But when he found that out, that it was really to subdue the Soviets and not against the Germans, and the war in Germany had ended actually, of course, by end of 1944, it was pretty clear that the Germans were not going to have their own bomb. He wanted to leave the project, and he was the only physicist to leave the Manhattan Project on the grounds of conscience. He went on to decide that his research would only have peaceful ends. He was interested in medical and biological uses of radiation, and he became a prominent critic of the nuclear arms race. He was the youngest signatory of the Russell-Einstein Manifesto in 1955. He went on to help found the Pugwash conferences, and he went on to win the Nobel Prize, this one in peace. And so for my closing comment, let me just say that central to his view, Rotblat's view of the world, were the words from the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, and he used these words to conclude his acceptance lecture for the Nobel Prize in 1995. Above all, remember your humanity. And with that, I will close with this slide, and thank you for your attention. I want to give special thanks to the people who helped me get materials together: Alan Carr, the Los Alamos Labs historian; Tony Redondo, the person who hired me into theoretical division. And then you see some names that are added because of my Brookhaven connection: Ed Sierra, Dina Buckaloo, and Steve Mussolino for their help, and Tracy Coyle for helping set this up, and a list of some references as well as contact information, because I don't know that I'll have time to answer all the questions. With that, I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and thank you for your attention.
Jack, thanks so much for that talk. Before I wrap it up with some closing comments, Dina, can you pick off some of the questions that people had asked during Jack's talk?
Yeah, let me pick through some of them here. Some of them were kind of personal to Jack. You should be able to see that. Stephen Schwartz, a personal connection. I grew up in St. Louis near Washington University. Washington University was the beneficiary of many scientists from Los Alamos, especially in chemistry. Sam Weisman comes to mind, I think a half dozen. In physics, I know Condon and Compton were at Washington U, but not sure of a Los Alamos connection.
Yeah, I don't know about their connection physically to Los Alamos. I'm certainly, anybody who was part of the Manhattan Project was aware as a scientist of what was going on at Los Alamos. Wigner, for example, I didn't talk about in this part of the talk because he was influential in the Manhattan Project, but he never came to Los Alamos during the war. He stayed and helped with the reactors to try to generate material for the bombs. So, you know, I think many people, it's been estimated that 500,000 people were involved in the Manhattan Project one way or another, but I don't know about Los Alamos connections.
Okay.
And, you know, I'm going to pick two questions off here that I can see, and then you can help me with others. One question was talking about Louis Slotin and his tragic accident. Louis Slotin did what was called tickling the dragon's tail. It was getting two half critical masses close together, but not too close together to measure the neutron production, but not going critical. And a screwdriver slipped and the thing went critical, and he separated it to save the lives of the other people, but he got an enormous dose. That took place after the war. He was still there in Los Alamos in '46, and he died tragically of radiation poisoning. My thesis advisor, Ralph Loveberg, was a graduate student at Los Alamos in the early '50s. And Ralph Loveberg told me that it was required reading to go through the Slotin medical report. Every new employee of Los Alamos had to read the Slotin medical report. It was very gruesome, but it was supposed to emphasize to people that radioactive accidents are not what you want to have happen. Beverly and I went to the building, which is still standing, where Slotin's accident took place, and they mark on the floor where the accident took place, where Slotin was standing, where the others were standing. It's quite an eerie experience. So I just wanted to share that. By the way, my first entry into the archives at Los Alamos was to find out about Slotin and about his Jewish connection. And Alan Carr helped me find the death notice and the telegram to the rabbi to invite him for conduct the funeral and all that. There was a lot of information about Slotin there. Somebody else asked about not only were many of these people Jews, but many were Hungarian Jews. That's a very insightful comment. The Hungarians as a whole were referred to as Martians because they seemed like a whole different planet of people. They were very close with each other. There were many Hungarians. You heard many of them mentioned: Teller, Wigner, Szilard, were all Hungarian Jews. Yes, it was a very important thing. If you read Wigner's interview on the Atomic Heritage Foundation site, he says that their training as students in Hungary clearly contributed to their excellence, and Jews were very focused on education. So I think they got an excellent training in Hungary, and that was very important for them. So now I'll come up for air. You can share any other questions you might have.
We had one from Robert Lennox. Says, even with the reality that these Jews were Jews in theory, LOL, do you think their pursuit of higher knowledge is related to something perhaps explicit or inexplicit in Jewish values or cultural experience?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question too. I don't know that I'm necessarily that qualified to answer. And I do have a whole talk, not for this venue, on how I can be a physicist and a rabbi at the same time. So I like to think that there's something related between the two. They're not just different halves of my brain that don't overlap. But I don't really know. I mean, it would be nice to think that, but I don't know. There's also a question I see about left-leaning nature, and I want to share a little bit about that. You know, we live in a different time. I don't know what it would have been like to live during the Depression and and to worry about social issues the way people did in the 30s. Oppenheimer, of course, was left-leaning. There were all sorts of questions about whether he actually joined the party or not. And certainly by the time of the McCarthy era, the pendulum had swung quite a bit, and that's how he lost his clearance. But, I am not an expert on that. I am not a historian. I'm not even really an amateur historian. So, I think I'd like to think that, there's probably some connection between Jews and left-leaning politics or left-leaning views. I don't know so much about the Communist Party. I will share this with you, though, because this is some individuals from the talk. George Placzek, as you may recall, went to the Soviet Union. His experience there was very eye-opening. And he supposedly is the one who told Oppenheimer that you may think that communism is a good thing, but the USSR communism is not a good thing. And I think he had a strong effect on, raising the veil from people's eyes who thought that the USSR under Stalin was communism as they might read about it in Das Kapital, for example. So I think it was that clear-sightedness of Placzek that probably influenced Oppenheimer and some others that being left-leaning was not equivalent to USSR Communist Party. I don't know if that helps answer the question, but it was an interesting thing that I read about.
We have another one from Mandy Bryson. Do you think the culture of the division is still influenced by the Jewish culture or heritage of those early scientists?
The Jewish culture, I would say, hard to tell. International flavor, absolutely. I was very proud of the international character of T Division, and I think that went on continuously from 1943 to the present day. Way more than half of the years of T Division's history, it has been led by somebody who was born outside of the United States. And my successor was named not too long ago and was also born outside the United States, continuing that tradition. And it's now a woman. So I think that's actually wonderful. But the Jewish heritage, hard to say. I think for those of you who understand about a Jewish prayer quorum, a minyan of 10 adult Jews, I think we would have been hard pressed to put a minyan together in T Division in my stint there. There were certainly some Jews, but I don't know that we in any way dominated anything. But international flavor, absolutely. And let me just mention, I have nowhere to go. I'm in a pandemic, so I'm happy to stay on. If anybody needs to drop off, you've been very patient and you've been on for a long time. So, you should feel free to drop off, but I'm happy to answer questions too if people want to stay for some questions.
Okay, well, we have one more from Marlene Mirabili. Do you think being born Jewish or of Jewish descent influenced their thinking regarding the weapon they were building? Was their experience with anti-Semitism a factor in their work?
Yeah, so the anti-Semitism, I will tell you, in almost every case, I found evidence of the individuals experiencing firsthand anti-Semitism. I could probably click through with every one of those individuals where I did enough research, I would find something. And I don't think people forget that. So I think that probably had some effect on them. And again, about whether their Jewish heritage affected their attitudes about the bomb, I don't know. Certainly, there was some connection to worrying about the Germans getting the bomb, and I don't think it was lost on people that the Germans were targeting Jews. So, it would be hard to characterize them all as a group, but probably there was some connection. I think that's the reason that Rotblat left, because when the Germans weren't the enemy for the bomb anymore, I think he realized that the ground rules had changed. And I think it's a complex problem. I don't know that I'm equipped to answer that in any more detail.
Okay. Mr. Lennick, again, let's cut to the core question underlying this presentation. There are, as usual, a disproportionate number of Jews in this process. How do you explain this?
I guess my answer is simply, I don't try to explain it. And as a rabbi, my focus is on Jews today and Jews for tomorrow. I just take pride in finding out about Jews from yesteryear. And, you know, I don't know that I have explanations for any of that. And, you know, as I say, you'd be hard pressed to find any of them who said that Judaism was central to their lives. But I actually think that, you know, it would be hard to say how much their heritage influenced them.
Okay, there was one that says, thing is popping around. How much is the Rad Lab considered a prequel to the Manhattan Project?
Yeah, I don't know much about the Rad Lab. I actually, when I showed the picture of Rabbi, which went zipping by, I apologize. There were 3 Nobel Prize winners in that photo. There was Lawrence on the left and Fermi in the middle, and then Rabbi on the right. A famous photograph of the 3 Nobel Prize winners, but Lawrence associated with the Rad Lab. You know, I don't know much about that history, and my career is not going to continue long enough for me to leave Brookhaven and go on to any laboratory out west in California. So I think that part of the story, that chapter, is going to have to be done by somebody else.
Okay. Gary Burgess, how close were the Germans?
Yeah, my understanding is not very close. That's a really good question. Again, there's a ton of history on this, not much of which I've researched, but I think it turns out they were really not very close. You know, the Manhattan Project, even with the fact that Oppenheimer misjudged the scientific needs of Los Alamos by, you know, orders of magnitude, the Manhattan Project was really dominated by the factory piece of it. The enormous effort to produce the material, both the uranium and the plutonium, swamped by numbers anything at Los Alamos. And I think nobody else realized that you could just pour a ton of money in and do something on that scale. I think the Germans probably realized you would have to do that, but I don't think anybody thought in their right minds that the US would do it. So I don't think they were terribly far along. But I don't know any real details about it. And if you wanted to read some interesting history about it, you definitely want to look into Heisenberg, because he's a central figure in that story. Also a Nobel Prize winner from Germany, who was in Germany. I think he had some role to play in this, but you know, I think that's not the history that I know.
Most of the rest of these are platitudes, and thanks
well, so
for a nice talk.
Well, we can probably skip the platitudes. And again, you know, maybe what I'll do is I'll share the screen to close so that if you do want contact information, you will have it. By all means, shoot me an email, either to my Brookhaven address down here on the left or my personal email on the right, and I'll be happy to interact with you. By the way, I've had wonderful opportunities to connect with descendants of the Manhattan Project scientists, and I look forward to learning more about some of these individuals. So, you know, please shoot me an email if you want to follow up on any of this. And again, thank you for your patience.
And this presentation was recorded, so it should be available through the ANS.
Thanks very much.
So Jack, let me close with a few comments. I'd be honored to introduce you to give another talk. And I think the next time I do have to introduce you as physicist, rabbi, and indeed historian. So if I had to write a few notes during your talk, I would say, Jack, what a wonderful and fascinating historical study of the origins of the Manhattan Project, to include the colorful and lively significant characters and some of the experimental work that shaped the project. You gave us a real treat tonight, a real treat that we all enjoyed. So I want to thank you so much for that. And also, it's been our long-standing tradition here at the Long Island section of the American Nuclear Society to present our speaker. I actually took a trip down to the wine cellar earlier to present our speaker with 2 bottles of Long Island's finest wine. And you can kind of see I do have 2 bottles here. And it's going to be a privilege when I see you again at the National Laboratory to give you these bottles of wine. So
Thanks very much.
I want to thank you so much again. I want to thank Dina. I want to thank Tracy. And I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. It was a great night. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, good night, everybody.
Thanks again, and we appreciate your attention.